Hi, my name is Aaron Yanello, and I will be discussing skill squatting attacks on Amazon Alexa. This was a paper presented for the first time at the 27th USENIX Security Symposium in 2018. These are the authors of the paper. I will not insult them by attempting to and ultimately unsuccessfully pronouncing their last names, but they are all from the University of Illinois. So just to give you a little heads up as to where we're going, I'll start with a study summary, go into a little bit of background mentioned in the paper, things that the authors thought were relevant for the audience to know, then discuss their methodology, and then dive into how they went about understanding Alexa errors, skill squatting, spear skill squatting, the limitation and countermeasures that they present and discuss in the paper, some future work that they indicated, some related work, and we'll wrap it up after that. So without further ado, let's get going. Voice-controlled devices such as the Amazon Alexa were once the topic of sci-fi films, but now are pretty common household devices. Though these devices are constantly improving, they often misinterpret user speech. Anyone who has ever used one of these devices knows how frequently these errors occur, and they often require you to repeat yourself. So the authors of this paper found that many of these misinterpretations are in fact systematic, and they happen consistently. And those words or phrases that are consistently misinterpreted can be leveraged by an attacker to route a user to a malicious application without their knowledge or consent. And they have deemed this attack skill squatting. Now, in this paper, the authors discuss how and why certain phrases are reliably misinterpreted, how these misinterpretations are used in skill squatting, and the security concerns that are presented in such an attack. Then they go on to mention some countermeasures. So we'll get into that a little bit. The motivating question behind this study was not actually explicitly stated by the authors, though I did a little bit of inferring on my own. And so I think that the question that the authors were ultimately trying to answer in this paper were voice assistants like the Amazon Alexa frequently misinterpret user input. But the question here is, can consistent errors be leveraged to cause harm to users? So a little bit of background about voice interfaces in general. Voice interfaces have been a topic of study since the 1970s, but general purpose voice interface devices were not really available to the mass consumer market until recently, and they have grown pretty rapidly in popularity. In 2018, an estimated 39 million adult Americans owned a smart speaker, and roughly 70% of those were the Amazon Alexa. Many companies have leveraged this ubiquity by developing skills, so to speak, to provide easy access to their own services through voice. Popular among these are rideshare like Lyft and Uber, or banking like American Express or maybe Chase, and some other retail companies like Amazon, Walmart, those types of things. One of the reasons for Amazon Alexa's popularity is its extensibility, because users can develop applications that leverage Alexa's voice services. These are called skills. This improves their device's capability, and they can customize its functionality to a user's needs. Skills are designed to have an invocation phrase, which when spoken will be routed to Alexa cloud servers. The request will then be forwarded appropriately. Then a reply is sent back to the device and played for the end user, and you can see a picture of that here. In 2017, a change was made that had significant security implications, and this was that the user no longer was required to manually give a skill permission before it could be invoked. And you'll see how impactful this change was in just a little bit. But before then, it is important that we go over phonemes. Now, I didn't know what phonemes were exactly when I read the study. Some of you probably did, but I will go over this anyway. So this work considers how the pronunciation of certain words lead to the misinterpretation of requests. Word pronunciations are broken down into these things called phonemes, which are a speaker-independent means of describing units of sound that define the pronunciation of a particular word. The Advanced Research Projects Agency, or ARPA for short, developed a standard phoneme ASCII representation, which they use in this work, and that is called the ARPA bet. So you can see a couple examples of phoneme representations of words from the alphabet here. The example that they give in the study is pronounced, which is represented by P, R, A, H, N, A, W, N, S. I've included a second example here of Amazon, since I thought that was fairly relevant, whose phoneme representation is AE, M, AH, Z, AA, N. Okay, on to the methodology proposed by the authors. They developed a speech-to-text test harness, and essentially what they found was there was no reliable way to extract the transcriptions that Alexa does on the server side. So in order to collect transcriptions done by the Alexa servers, the authors developed a skill called record this, and that returns the transcribed request from Alexa. So the transcriptions are recorded and then aggregated for comparison to the initial request. So some device was able to play the audio of a particular word. Alexa would hear that word would be brought out to Alexa services, then transcribed, and then returned back to the client side, and the responses were then recorded and aggregated for further analysis. The primary data set they used for this study was Ohio State University's nationwide speech project, which included 60 speakers, 50% male, 50% female, from 6 different geographical dialect regions of the United States, and included 188 words and 11,460 audio samples. Another data set that was used in this study was called Forvo. This is a crowdsourced data set. It was comprised of 4,991 speakers from across the USA, 59,403 words, 91,843 samples. This second data set was only used for cross-validation purposes, though, because 60% of the words were only spoken by a single speaker, which makes reasoning about interpretation errors very difficult. And also the audio quality was not uniform in these samples, so variations in noise were pretty difficult to quantify. During their tests, the authors found that Alexa is non-deterministic in its responses, even when presented with identical audio files over a reliable network, which just means that the transcriptions were not consistent for any given input. The authors speculated that this is probably due to some combination of A/B testing, system load, or evolving speech recognition models. So each sample in the NSP dataset was tested 50 times to account for this non-determinism. Part of their analysis includes investigating how interpretation errors relates to Alexa skill names. So a list of all 25,150 publicly available skill names from the Alexa skill store were collected for this analysis. I should mention that these skills were collected back in 2018 when this study was performed, so there are likely more skills out on the market today. Now, before we dive into the actual error analysis that the authors performed, they thought it was pertinent to include some ethical considerations. First, there was no interaction with human subjects from which the samples were collected. Also, public data sets were used and usage guidelines for these data sets were followed to a T. Alexa requests were throttled so as not to affect the availability of the production services. Also, attacks were tested only in a development environment, and no malicious skills were published to the skill store. Finally, all attacks were disclosed to Amazon. Okay, getting on to the error analysis. So we'll start with quantifying the errors. It was found that Alexa correctly interpreted 68.9% of the queries that were tested. Some notable observations are single-syllable words tend to have a lower accuracy, while multi-syllable words typically had a higher accuracy. One of the notable exceptions to this is the word good. Now, the authors didn't provide any speculation for this. My crude speculation is it probably has something to do with the frequency of use for the word good in the English language. And so the word good was probably overrepresented in whatever dataset Amazon used to train their speech recognition model. But again, this is a wild speculation, not necessarily the views of the author. Now, it was found that there is significant variation in the misinterpretations of words. For example, bean, B-E-A-N, is misinterpreted 12 different ways, including bin, B-E-E-N, beam, B-E-A-M, and bing, B-I-N-G. While unadvised, UNADVISED, is misinterpreted 140 different ways, including an advised, I devised, and hundred biased. The median number of misinterpretations was 15. Despite the variations in misinterpretations, it was found that for each word, Alexa outputs one or two misinterpretations more frequently than others. So the authors introduced the notion of the most common error, or MCE. For example, boil, B-O-I-L, was misinterpreted 100% of the time, and it was interpreted as boyle, B-O-Y-L-E, 94.3% of the time, which is the MCE rate. Now, since the MCE rate was above 50%, meaning that majority of the time it was interpreted as boyle, B-O-Y-L-E, the authors claim that boyle, B-O-Y-L-E, is the predictable misinterpretation of boil, B-O-I-L. The graph that you see is directly from the paper, and that is a plot of probability of error with the probability of most common error, with one notable exception, and that is the red quadrant lines were actually drawn by me, and that is for illustrative purposes. So starting with quadrant 3 in the bottom left, 56.4% of the words tested were interpreted correctly most of the time and had no prevalent MCE. That means errors were uncommon and there was no obvious pattern to the errors. And the bottom right in quadrant 4, 21.3% of the words were interpreted correctly but do have a prevalent MCE. Quadrant 2 is made up of 9.6% of the words, and they were misinterpreted often but have no prevalent MCE. So they were often misinterpreted but had no distinguishable pattern of those errors. And then finally, and this is the quadrant that the rest of the paper discusses and focuses on, is quadrant 1 in the top right. This quadrant consists of 12.8% of the words, and they were misinterpreted often and have a prevalent MCE. These words can be said to have a reliable misinterpretation. Digging into the errors a little bit in quadrant 1, there were actually 24 words in quadrant 1. It was found that 1/3 are homophones, words that are spelled differently but have the same pronunciation. Some such words are sail and sail, calm and calm, sell and sell, and these also include words that are confused with proper nouns like main and main. 2 of the words were compound words, which Alexa breaks down into the constituent words. These words are superhighway and outdoors. 41.7%, so 10 words, can be explained by examining the underlying phonetic structures of the input words and their errors. In each case, the MCE differs phonetically from the input word by a single phoneme. Now, these words are shown in the table to the right here, but a couple examples are rip and rap, which only differ by the middle phoneme, IH and AE. Or you can maybe take dime and time, which differ only by the first phoneme, the D and the T. And then in this last misinterpretation down at the bottom, sweeten and Sweden differ only by the center T in Sweden and the center D in Sweden. There were 3 words with a most common error but really had no discernible logical explanation for them, and the authors didn't seem to speculate even further on those. Those words were mill to know, full to for, and earthy to fi. Now we understand the errors, let's dig into what skill squatting actually is. Skill squatting is exploiting predictable errors to surreptitiously route users to a malicious Alexa skill. The core idea behind this is, given a systematic error from one word to another, an adversary constructs a malicious skill that has a high likelihood of confusion with the target skill on the Alexa skill store. When a user attempts to invoke a skill, they are instead routed to the malicious skill due to the systematic error. This is a similar concept to typo squatting, if you've ever heard of this. It's where an attacker predicts a common quote unquote typo in a domain name and abuses it to hijack the request to a certain domain. The authors first wanted to address whether this skill will work end to end. The authors attempted this exploit in an Amazon skill invocation environment by creating their own target skill and squatted skill, the malicious skill. And these skills are displayed on the screen in this table. A couple of them that we have mentioned already are wet and what, and boil and boil, and rip and wrap. So when a user says, Alexa, ask boil hello, they would then be routed to the boil, B-O-Y-L-E skill instead. The authors built an error model and trained the model with half of the speakers and then tested it on the other half. The 27 squattable skills that you see here were created using this analysis. And so for each speaker, in the test set, they constructed a request to each of the 27 target skills and measured how many times the squatted skill was triggered, repeating each request 5 times to address the non-determinism. They were able to successfully squat skills at least once for 25 of the 27 squattable skills, that's 92.6%, and concluded therefore that squatted skills are possible in a skill invocation environment. Some notable results here are boil, B-O-I-L, to boil, B-O-Y-L-E, and loud, L-O-U-D, to louder, L-O-U-D-E-R. The authors didn't offer much speculation on the boil to boil misinterpretation, but surmised that the loud to louder misinterpretation was probably due to louder being a keyword for the Alexa device to increase its volume, so the request never actually made it to any other particular skill, just the local functionality to raise the volume. To test the feasibility of squatting an existing skill, the authors identified skills currently on the skill store, which included a word in the name that matched a consistently misinterpreted word. An existing example of this is quick calm to quick calm. And so using the very limited speech corpus that they had at their disposal, the authors identified 11 skills, which are displayed on the screen, currently on the skill store at the time of the study, that could potentially be squatted. Due to the very limited data set, the pool of squatted skills was very small. As you just saw, there were only 11 of the 25,000 plus skills on the Amazon Skill Store at the time of this study. The authors describe a possible method for extending this pool using previously unobserved words. So since many skills use novel words like Wemo or infrequently used words like Uber, for example, acquiring a comprehensive corpus would be at the least cost prohibitive, if not entirely impossible. So the authors claim that a hacker could use reasoning about common phonetic misinterpretations to expand this pool of squattable skills. Take, for example, the luck to lock misinterpretation. A hacker can look at this and say that the AH phoneme is usually confused with the AA phoneme. So you can look at similar words like duck, for example, and guess that Amazon Alexa would misinterpret this as dock, or the same for cluck and misinterpret it as clock. Now, granted, skill names get a little more complex than this, so it's not always this trivial. For example, you can look at absentee, which is often misinterpreted as apps and tea. Therefore, the authors proposed a conservative approach that minimizes the total number of errors and discards the errors that cannot be attributed to any single phoneme. And that algorithm goes like this. They first identify input to output mappings of correct phonemes whose alignment provides the smallest cost or the fewest errors. So you can see in our absentee example that the correct phonemes, the phonemes that appear both in the input and in the output, are identified here and associated. AE, S, AH, N, T, IY. Then you would attribute phonemes in the output that do not appear in the input to a misinterpretation of the phoneme that immediately precedes them in the input. The example given here is you would contribute the misinterpretation of the phoneme N to ND. The remaining phonemes in the input are considered to be unambiguous if it A, occurs between two already mapped pairs of phonemes, or is the first or last phoneme in the input, and B, was either omitted or confused with one or two other phonemes in the output. That example here is this B to P association. You would then discard any ambiguous errors. An example of an ambiguous error in the paper was given as consume to film. This had many more than just one ambiguous association between phonemes, so you would throw that out. The author used this algorithm to build a phoneme error model using the original NSP dataset to see if they could predict Amazon misinterpretations. The 4-row dataset was then used to test this model, and the algorithm went like this. They attempted to replace each phoneme in each input with each of its possible misinterpretations. If the resultant phoneme string represented an English word, it was added to the list of potential misinterpretations. Otherwise, it was thrown out. So the example given in the paper was the UH to OW phoneme misinterpretation was pretty prevalent. So you could take a word with the phoneme UH, such as should, SHUHD, replace the UH with OW, SHOWD, find the associated word with that phoneme string, which in this case would be showed, then test to see if that's an English word. Show is an English word, so in this case it would be added to that pool of potential misinterpretations. This resulted in error predictions for 12,869 unique words. Then running this through their initial test harness, they found 3,606 of their predictions were correct, expanding their original list of 188 words by 17.5%. Applying the method of extending the seed set of errors to identify already existing instances of confused skills in the skills store, they found 381 unique pairs of skills that exhibit phoneme confusion, many of which have to do with Alexa misinterpreting the word fact, F-A-C-T, as facts, F-A-C-T-S, or facts, F-A-X. The authors then proposed that you could take skill squatting a step further by leveraging those misinterpretations more common among specific demographics rather than just those common to all users, and they deemed this spear skill squatting. So to test this, the speakers of the NSP dataset were separated into dialect regions, and a chi-squared test returned a p-value of 6.54 times 10 to the 139th power, which just indicates that at least one region has a significant difference in accuracy from the rest. The authors then separated the dataset by gender, and it was found that Alexa actually more accurately interpreted female speakers, about 71.9% of the time, over male speakers, about 66.6% of the time. The same procedure described earlier was used to identify squattable words for each of the dialect regions. After removing the systematic errors that occurred in all regions, it was found that there were 11 squattable words that target a strict subset of regions. You can see that list in the top right of the screen. And a couple examples here are pull, P-U-L-L, and pole, P-O-L-E, systematically affect speakers in the West, New England, Midland, and Mid-Atlantic regions. And the PAL, P-A-L, to POW, P-O-W misinterpretation systematically affects speakers from only the Midland region. This same technique was applied to men and women separately, and they found that 12 words affect speakers specifically by gender that an attacker could leverage. These words are listed here in the bottom right. Cross-validation in a skill invocation environment of both region-based attacks and gender-based attacks was performed in the same fashion as described earlier. It was found that 8 of the 11 region-based attacks were successful and 10 of the 12 gender-based attacks were successful. So while the authors recognized that the dataset was very limited, they'd indicate that this study proves that this type of attack is feasible. Limitations that the authors wanted to point out: The first is the limited scope and scale of the NSP dataset, and that is the core limitation of this study. That has been mentioned already a couple times in this presentation. The NSP dataset was comprised of only 188 words with 60 speakers, and the authors feel, I think accurately, that this is rather inadequate for testing the full-scale systematic interpretations of the Amazon Alexa. And the other limitation that they called out was that the tests were performed only in a development environment for ethical reasons. So it's really unknown exactly how these attacks would play out in a public production environment, but some further testing in coordination with Amazon would be needed for further analysis in a quote-unquote real-life scenario. The authors only mentioned one countermeasure, and I think they're correct in that this would be the at least main way to address this type of attack. And that is, Amazon should augment their skill store certification to include word-based and phoneme-based analysis to determine whether it may be confused with skills that are already registered, much like how some domain name registrars commonly restrict registration of homographs. Those are like domains that look very similar visually. This protects the user from accidentally typing in or misunderstanding a domain name and then navigating to a malicious site. Some future work that the authors mentioned were that they would like to perform similar tests using a larger, more diverse data set to fully test the systematic errors. Also, that this study proves that skill squatting is feasible, but does not test or even really speculate at the damage an attack of this kind could have on a system or the user. And then an interesting one that they called out was that users of modern technology have a healthy skepticism of the security of connected devices, but this doesn't really apply yet to the voice-controlled devices since the interaction is typically has no visual component. So if the interaction is out of sight, are the security implications out of mind? That's a question that the authors felt would need some investigation. And then finally, the models that were built for the study were very specific for the Amazon Alexa, though the concepts could be applied to similar voice-controlled systems. Therefore, some future studies would be aided by a more generalized model. Then some work that is related to the study is there are some investigations into phoneme analysis among different dialects and demographics. There is also investigations into human susceptibility to spam or phishing attacks, specifically pertaining to typo squatting, using homophone confusion and other types of variants of typo squatting. Then there are actually studies on variants of the skill squatting attack, one of which is a variant which involves Alexa's tendency to invoke the longest matching skill name and a user's tendency to surround their request with other common conversational words. So an attacker would create a skill that includes those words for Alexa to route a request to the skill with a longer name. So instead of saying Alexa open sleep sounds, which would invoke the sleep sounds skill, if a user says Alexa open sleep sounds please and is very polite about it, an attacker could create a skill called Sleep Sounds Please that Alexa could invoke instead. And then there are a lot of audio studies that revolve around audio that can be synthesized in a way that is indiscernible to humans but is actuated on by a audio controlled device, which could lead to some more reliable misinterpretations. So, in this study, the interpretation errors made by Amazon Alexa were investigated, and the findings of that investigation were used to prove that a malicious actor could, in fact, leverage a systematic misinterpretation of the Alexa device to invoke unintended, potentially malicious skills in a novel attack which the authors deemed skill squatting. This attack was proven to be feasible in a development environment and is possible in public based on the skills that currently are on the Alexa store. It also proves that this type of attack can be targeted by demographics in an attack called spear skill squatting. And that is a summary of the paper Skill Squatting Attacks on the Amazon Alexa. I thank you very much for listening. Have a great day.